The gymnasium pulsed with music, lights flashing in sync with the beat. But Eli Carter stood frozen at the edge of the dance floor, his heart pounding louder than the bass. He was 18, lanky, with a mop of brown hair that never quite stayed in place. And tonight, in his borrowed tuxedo, he felt like an imposter in his own life. 10 years ago, his father had walked out, leaving a void that no amount of teenage bravado could fill in till Jamie came along. Eli's eyes darted to Jamie Torres, his date, who was laughing with friends by the punch table. Jamie, with his sharp cheekbones and dark curls, had a way of making the world feel less heavy. They'd met in sophomore year, in the quiet of the school library, when Jamie slid a dog-eared copy of The Catcher in the Rye across the table and whispered, "This guy gets it." That was the start late-night texts, stolen glances in the hallway, and eventually, a kiss under the bleachers that made Eli's world tilt. But tonight, prom night, was their first public step as a couple, and the weight of it pressed against Eli's chest. The small town of Willow Creek, Ohio, wasn't exactly a haven for two boys in love. Whispers followed them, and Eli's mother, Sarah, though supportive, worried constantly. "Just be careful," she'd said, adjusting his tie before he left. Careful. As if love could be cautious. Eli scanned the crowd, half expecting judgment in every glance. But his gaze snagged on a figure in the Shadowsa man, older, with a familiar slump to his shoulders. His breath caught. It couldn't be. "Eli, you okay?" Jamie's voice cut through the haze, his hand brushing Eli's arm. Those brown eyes, warm and steady, grounded him. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Maybe I have," Eli murmured, his voice barely audible over the music. The man in the shadows shifted, and for a moment, Eli swore he saw the same jawline he remembered from childhood, the one that used to lift him onto broad shoulders. His father, David, who'd vanished when Eli was 8, leaving only a note, "I'm sorry. I can't stay." Eli's chest tightened. He hadn't seen David in a decade, not since the man packed a duffel bag and drove away, leaving Eli crying in the driveway. Sarah had worked double shifts at the diner to keep them afloat, never bad-mouthing David. But Eli felt the betrayal in every late bill, every missed school event. Why would he be here now, watching from the edges of Eli's life? Jamie followed Eli's gaze, his expression darkening. "Who's that?" he asked, his protective streak flaring. Eli shook his head, unable to answer. The truth was, he didn't know if he wanted to confront the man or run. The music slowed, and Jamie tugged Eli's hand. "Dance with me," he said, not a question, but a lifeline. Eli let himself be pulled onto the dance floor, his eyes flickering back to the shadows. The man was still there, watching, and Eli's heart warred between anger and a childish hope he thought he'd buried years ago. As they swayed, Jamie's arms around him, Eli felt the room blur. Prom was supposed to be a celebration, a milestone, but for Eli, it was a collision of past and present. He leaned into Jamie, whispering, "He's here. My dad." Jamie's grip tightened, and in that moment, Eli knew he wasn't facing this alone. The night stretched on, the crowd thinning as couples drifted to after-parties. Eli and Jamie stayed, dancing to every slow song, defiance in every step. But Eli couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. When he finally looked again, the man was gone, leaving only questions in his wake. Had it really been David? And if so, why now? Eli's mind raced back to his childhood nights spent waiting for a father who never came back. The sting of being the kid with no dad at baseball games. He'd built walls around that pain, but Jamie had slipped through them, piece by piece. Now, with his father possibly reappearing, Those walls felt fragile. "Whatever happens," Jamie said, his voice low as they left the gym, "we face it together." Eli nodded, but his heart was a storm. The past wasn't done with him yet. The cool night air hit Eli's face as he and Jamie stepped out of the gymnasium, the music fading into a distant hum. His borrowed tuxedo felt too tight, his palms sweaty despite the chill. He couldn't stop scanning the parking lot, half expecting to see that familiar silhouette again. But the lot was empty except for scattered cars and a few straggling prom-goers laughing under the streetlights. "You sure it was him?" Jamie asked, his voice gentle but probing. He leaned against a lamppost, his dark curls catching the light, and Eli wanted to tell him everything. How the man's posture, the way he tilted his head, felt like a memory carved into his bones. But the words stuck in his throat. "I don't know," Eli admitted, kicking at a pebble. "It's been 10 years. Jamie. Maybe I'm just seeing what I want to see." Or what he feared. He wasn't sure which was worse. Jamie stepped closer, his hand finding Eli's. "If it was him, what do you want to do about it?" His tone was steady, but Eli caught the flicker of worry in his eyes. Jamie knew the stories: how David's departure had left Eli and Sarah scrambling, how Eli had spent years blaming himself, wondering what he'd done to make his father leave. "I don't know," Eli repeated, his voice cracking. "Part of me wants to scream at him, ask why he abandoned us. The other part," he trailed off, ashamed of the longing that still lingered, the part that wanted his father to explain, to make it right. They walked to Jamie's beat-up Honda, the silence heavy between them. Inside, Jamie turned on the heater, and the hum filled the quiet. "Let's go somewhere," he said suddenly. "Not the after-party. Somewhere real." Eli nodded, grateful for the distraction. They drove to the old quarry at the edge of town, a place they'd found last summer, where the stars felt closer and the world felt theirs. The gravel crunched under their tires as they parked, and they climbed onto the hood, lying back to stare at the sky. "Tell me about him," Jamie said, his voice soft. "Your dad." Eli exhaled, his breath visible in the cold. "He was fun when I was little. Took me fishing, taught me how to throw a curveball. But he was restless, always pacing, like he was running from something. Then one day, he just left." Eli's voice hardened. "No warning, no goodbye? Just a note." Jamie turned to face him, propping himself on one elbow. "That's on him, Eli. Not you." His words were firm, but his touch was gentle, brushing a strand of hair from Eli's forehead. "You're enough. You've always been enough." Eli wanted to believe him, but the doubt was an old wound, reopened tonight. They lay there for hours, talking about everything and nothing: college plans, Jamie's dream of studying marine biology, Eli's hope to become a writer. The stars above seemed to listen, and for a moment, Eli felt whole. The next morning, reality crashed back. Eli's phone buzzed with a text from his mom. "Heard from your dad. He's in town. Wants to see you." Eli's stomach dropped. Sarah had never pushed him to reconnect, but her message was careful, neutral, like she was testing the waters. Eli showed Jamie the text over breakfast at the diner, where Sarah worked the morning shift. Jamie's jaw tightened. "You don't owe him anything," he said, stabbing at his pancakes. "But if you want to hear him out, I'm with you. Every step." Eli stared at the text, his mind a tangle of anger and curiosity. Why now? What could David possibly say to make up for a decade of silence? He thought of the man in the shadows at prom, the way he'd watched but didn't approach. Maybe he was just as scared as Eli was. "I need to know," Eli said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I need to know why he left. Jamie nodded, his hand squeezing Eli's under the table. Then we'll find him. Together. They spent the day driving around Willow Creek, checking the motel, the old bar David used to frequent, even the park where he'd once pushed Eli on the swings. No sign of him. By dusk, Eli's hope was fraying, but Jamie kept him grounded, cracking jokes and stealing fries from Eli's plate when they stopped for food. As the sun set, they pulled into the lot of the town's only coffee shop, and there he was, David, sitting alone at an outdoor table, a cup untouched in front of him. Eli froze, his heart hammering. The man looked older, grayer, but it was him. No mistaking it now. Eli, Jamie said softly, you got this. Eli took a deep breath, his hand trembling as he reached for the door handle. 10 years of questions surged forward, and he wasn't sure if he was ready for the answers. Eli's shoes scuffed against the pavement as he approached the coffee shop table, each step heavier than the last. David looked up, his eyes widening, and for a moment, Eli saw the man from his childhood, the one who'd laughed too loud, who'd smelled of aftershave and motor oil. But the years had carved lines into David's face, and his hands fidgeted nervously around the coffee cup. Eli, David said, his voice rough, like he hadn't spoken in days. You've grown up. Eli stood rigid, Jamie a steady presence at his side. Yeah, he said, his tone clipped. That happens in 10 years. The words came out sharper than he intended, but he didn't regret them. Not yet. David winced, gesturing to the empty chairs. Can we talk? Please. Eli hesitated, glancing at Jamie, who gave a small nod. They sat, the metal chairs cold against their legs. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken history. Jamie's knee pressed against Eli's under the table, a quiet anchor. I saw you last night, Eli said finally, his voice low. At prom. Why were you there? David's shoulders slumped. I heard you were graduating. Wanted to see you, even if it was from a distance. He looked down, his fingers tracing the rim of his cup. I didn't know how to approach you. Not after everything. Everything, Eli echoed, his anger flaring. You mean walking out? Leaving Mom to pick up the pieces? Leaving me? His voice cracked, and he hated how young it made him sound. David's eyes glistened, but Eli refused to feel pity. I was a mess back then, Eli, David said. I wasn't ready to be a father. I thought you'd be better off without me. Better off. Eli's hands clenched into fists. Mom worked herself to the bone. I spent years thinking I wasn't enough to make you stay. Jamie's hand found his, squeezing gently, and Eli took a shaky breath. I'm not asking for forgiveness, David said. I wanted to see who you've become. And I saw you with, he glanced at Jamie, hesitating. With your friend. Boyfriend, Eli corrected, his chin lifting. His name's Jamie. The word felt like a declaration, a line drawn in the sand. Jamie's fingers tightened around his. A silent I'm proud of you. David nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. I'm glad you have someone, he said, and it sounded genuine, but Eli didn't trust it. Not yet. Why now? Eli pressed. Why come back after all this time? David leaned back, rubbing a hand over his face. I've been sober 3 years. Got a job in Columbus, a small place to call my own. But I couldn't stop thinking about you. About the years I missed. He paused, his voice breaking. I know I don't deserve a second chance, but I had to try. Eli's throat burned. He wanted to scream, to walk away, But something kept him rooted, maybe the part of him that still remembered fishing trips and bedtime stories. Jamie leaned closer, whispering, "You don't have to decide anything now." They talked for an hour. The conversation stilted but raw. David spoke of his struggles: alcohol, debt, a life unmoored. Eli listened, torn between resentment and a fragile curiosity. When they finally stood to leave, David handed Eli a scrap of paper with a phone number. "If you ever want to talk," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Eli took it, but he didn't promise anything. As he and Jamie walked back to the car, the weight of the encounter settled over him. "What do I do with this?" he asked, holding up the paper. Jamie pulled him into a hug, his warmth cutting through the evening chill. "You figure it out when you're ready. And I'll be here." The next few days were a blur. Eli carried the number in his pocket, touching it like a talisman, unsure if it was a lifeline or a trap. He and Jamie spent their time as they always did, hanging out at the quarry, sneaking into the library after hours, dreaming of a future beyond Willow Creek. But David's return loomed over everything, a shadow Eli couldn't shake. One night, Eli found himself at the diner, sitting across from Sarah. Her hands, calloused from years of waitressing, wrapped around a mug of tea. "He called me a week ago," she admitted when Eli asked. "Said he wanted to make things right. I told him it's your choice, not mine." Eli stared at the table, tracing the worn formica. "Do you think he's changed?" Sarah sighed, her eyes soft but guarded. "People can change, Eli. But that doesn't erase the past. Whatever you decide, make sure it's for you, not him." Eli nodded, but the decision felt impossible. He wanted to hate David, to keep the anger that had fueled him for years. But he also wanted answers, closure, maybe even a chance to understand. Eli sat on the edge of his bed, the scrap of paper with David's number in his hand, its edges fraying from days of being folded and unfolded. The room was quiet except for the hum of the old fan, a stark contrast to the chaos in his head. Jamie was sprawled on the floor, sketching in his notebook, his presence a steady comfort in the storm of Eli's thoughts. "You gonna call him?" Jamie asked, not looking up from his drawing of a coral reef, all vibrant blues and greens. His voice was casual, but Eli knew he was watching, waiting. "I don't know," Eli said for what felt like the 100th time. "What if he just leaves again?" The fear was raw, a wound that hadn't healed. He'd spent so long building a life without David's school, Jamie, his mom. Why risk letting him back in? Jamie set his pencil down and crawled over, sitting cross-legged in front of Eli. "You're not that kid anymore," he said, his eyes searching Eli's. "You're stronger than he ever was. If he bails, you'll survive. You've got us." He gestured vaguely, encompassing Sarah, their friends, the life they'd carved out. Eli managed a small smile, but the weight of the decision pressed harder. That night, he texted David, "Can we meet?" "Tomorrow, noon, at the park." The reply came almost instantly, "I'll be there." The park was quiet when Eli and Jamie arrived, the swings creaking in the breeze. David was already there, sitting on a bench, looking smaller than Eli remembered. His hair was grayer, his frame thinner, but Eli's eyes were the same. "Thanks for coming," David said as they approached, his voice tentative. Jamie hung back, giving Eli space but staying close enough to be a silent support. Eli sat, his hands stuffed in his pockets. "I need to know why," he said, cutting to the chase. "Why you left. Why you didn't come back." David took a deep breath, his gaze fixed on the ground. "I was drowning, Eli. In debt, in booze, in my own head." Your mom and we were fighting all the time, and I felt like I was failing you both. I thought leaving would give you a chance at something better. Better? Eli's voice rose, sharp with disbelief. You left us with nothing. Mom worked herself sick. I had to figure out who I was without you. David flinched, but he didn't look away. I know. I was a coward. I told myself I'd come back when I got my life together. But by then, too much time had passed. I was ashamed. Eli's chest ached, a mix of anger and something softer, more dangerous understanding. He hated it, but he saw the truth in David's eyes. The man wasn't making excuses. He was laying himself bare. They talked for hours, the conversation a slow unraveling of years. David spoke of rehab, of scraping by in odd jobs, of waking up one day and realizing he'd lost his son. Eli listened, asking questions, probing the gaps in his memories. Jamie stayed nearby, occasionally tossing a pebble into the pond, giving Eli the space to navigate this on his own. By the time the sun dipped low, Eli felt drained but lighter. He didn't forgive David not yet, but he understood him a little more. As they stood to leave, David hesitated, then said, I'm proud of you, Eli. You're more than I ever was. Eli didn't respond, but the words lingered, heavy with possibility. In the car, Jamie reached for his hand. You okay? He asked, his voice soft. Yeah, Eli said, and for the first time, he almost meant it. I think I am. The weeks that followed were a delicate balance. Eli and David texted sporadically, small steps towards something undefined. Eli didn't trust it fully, but he was willing to try. Jamie was his constant, his anchor, reminding him that he didn't have to face this alone. One evening, as they sat on the quarry's edge, Jamie pulled out his sketchbook and showed Eli a drawing, a portrait of them at prom, hands clasped, faces lit with defiance and love. This is us, Jamie said. No matter what happens with your dad, this is what matters. Eli kissed him, the stars above them bright and unyielding. For the first time, he felt like he could carry the past without letting it define him. Summer crept into Willow Creek, the air thick with humidity and the buzz of cicadas. Eli and Jamie spent their days preparing for college. Eli at Ohio State for creative writing, Jamie at a coastal school for marine biology. The distance loomed, a quiet ache neither spoke of, but their nights at the quarry, hands intertwined, made it bearable. David's presence became a cautious thread in Eli's life. They met weekly now, always in public coffee shops, the park, neutral ground. Each meeting peeled back another layer of the past. David shared stories Eli had forgotten, teaching him to ride a bike, the time they built a lopsided birdhouse. But he also owned his failures, the nights he drank too much, the fights with Sarah that left Eli hiding in his room. One afternoon, as they sat by the pond, David pulled out a photo, creased and faded. It was Eli at 6, grinning toothlessly on David's shoulders. I carried this everywhere, David said, his voice thick. Even when I was at my worst. It was the only thing that kept me going. Eli stared at the photo, his throat tight. Why didn't you call? Right. Anything. The question had haunted him for years. David's eyes dropped. I thought you hated me. I didn't want to make things worse. You did anyway, Eli said, but the anger was softer now, tempered by time and these fragile new conversations. He handed the photo back, and David tucked it away like it was precious. At home, Eli showed the photo to Sarah, who smiled sadly. He loved you, Eli. In his broken way. She hugged him, and for the first time, Eli didn't feel like he had to choose between his parents' truths. Jamie, as always, was his sounding board. One night, as they lay on a blanket under the stars, Eli admitted, "I don't know if I can forgive him, but I want to try." Jamie turned to him, his face half lit by moonlight. "That's enough for now. You're doing this on your terms." He kissed Eli's forehead, and the tenderness of it made Eli's chest ache with gratitude. But the town wasn't as kind. Word of Eli and Jamie's relationship had spread, and with it came sidelong glances, muttered comments at the diner. One day, a group of guys from school cornered Eli outside the hardware store, their words sharp with venom. "Freak," one spat, shoving him. Eli stumbled, his heart racing, but before he could respond, Jamie was there, stepping between them. "Back off," Jamie said, his voice low but fierce. The guys laughed but retreated, and Jamie pulled Eli away, his hands shaking with anger. "They're idiots," he said later, as they sat in his car. "They don't get to define us." Eli nodded, but the encounter lingered, a reminder of the world they lived in. He wondered if David knew, if he'd seen the way Eli and Jamie held hands at prom. Would he accept it? Or would he disappear again? The question gnawed Eli, and at their next meeting, he decided to test it. "You know about me and Jamie," he said, his voice steady despite the knot in his stomach. "What do you think?" David paused, his coffee cup halfway to his mouth. "I think you're happy. And that's all I ever wanted for you." His voice was quiet, but there was no judgment in it, only a tentative hope. Eli exhaled, relief washing over him. It wasn't full acceptance. Not yet, but it was a start. As they parted, David hugged him a quick, awkward embrace, the first in a decade. Eli didn't hug back, but he didn't pull away either. That night, Eli and Jamie celebrated with milkshakes at the diner, Sarah sneaking them extra whipped cream. "You're building something good," she told Eli, her eyes bright. "With Jamie, with your dad. I'm proud of you." Eli smiled, his heart full. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, he felt ready to face it. August brought a bittersweet edge to Willow Creek. College was weeks away, and Eli felt the pull of time, each day with Jamie a precious countdown. They spent their mornings at the quarry, their afternoons helping Sarah at the diner, their nights dreaming of futures that felt both thrilling and terrifying. David's meetings with Eli grew more regular, less guarded. They talked about small things: music, baseball, the way Willow Creek had changed. But they also tackled the hard stuff: David's addiction, the years of silence, the guilt that still weighed on him. Eli began to see his father not as the villain of his childhood, but as a man who'd lost his way. One evening, David invited Eli and Jamie to his small apartment in Columbus, a 40-minute drive from Willow Creek. It was a modest place, cluttered with books and secondhand furniture, but it felt lived in, real. David cooked spaghetti, the sauce slightly burned, and they ate at a wobbly table, the conversation halting but warm. "I want to be part of your life," David said as they cleared the plates. "If you'll let me." His eyes were earnest, and Eli saw the weight of years in them, the regret, the hope. Eli glanced at Jamie, who gave a small nod, his hand brushing Eli's under the table. "We'll see," Eli said, his voice cautious but not cold. "One step at a time." The drive back was quiet, Jamie's hand resting on Eli's knee. "He's trying," Jamie said. "That's something." "Yeah," Eli agreed, staring out at the dark highway. "It's something." But the world outside their bubble wasn't so forgiving. At school, the harassment escalada note slipped into Eli's locker, crude words scrawled in marker. He showed it to Jamie, who crumpled it with a curse. "We're getting out of here soon," Jamie said, his voice fierce. This town doesn't get to keep us. Eli nodded, but the words stung, a reminder of the hate that shadowed their love. He wondered if David would stand by him if things got worse. The thought kept him awake that night, Jamie's steady breathing beside him a small comfort. The next week, David surprised Eli with tickets to a Reds game, a nod to their old bonding days. Jamie came along, and the three of them sat in the stands, the roar of the crowd a backdrop to their tentative connection. David asked Jamie about his studies, listened intently, and Eli felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this could work. But as they left the stadium, a group of men shouted slurs from across the parking lot, their voices cutting through the night. Eli froze, his heart pounding, but David stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "Leave them alone," he said, his stance protective. The men backed off, and David turned to Eli, his expression fierce. "No one gets to hurt you. Not on my watch." It was the first time Eli felt his father's strength, not as a memory, but as something real. In the car, Jamie squeezed Eli's hand, his eyes bright with pride. "He's got your back," he whispered. Eli nodded, his throat too tight to speak. For the first time, he believed David might stay. As college loomed closer, Eli and Jamie made plans to visit each other, to keep their love alive across the miles. David promised to write, to call, to show up. Eli didn't fully trust the promises, but he wanted to. And that was enough for now. The last days of summer slipped away, each moment with Jamie a treasure Eli tucked into his heart. They spent their final week together at the quarry, swimming in the cool water, laughing until their sides ached. But the looming separation cast a shadow, and Eli felt it in the quiet moments, when Jamie's smile faltered or his own thoughts turned to the distance ahead. David, too, was a constant presence now, his efforts steady if imperfect. He sent Eli articles about writing programs, called to check in, even showed up at the diner to help Sarah with a busy shift. Eli watched him, searching for the man who'd left, but found instead someone trying to rebuild. One evening, as Eli and Jamie sat on the diner's counter after closing, Sarah joined them, her apron still tied on. "Your dad's different now," she said, her voice soft. "Not perfect, but different. What do you think, Eli?" Eli traced a crack in the counter, his thoughts tangled. "I want to believe him," he said, "but I'm scared he'll disappear again." Sarah reached for his hand. "You've got a big heart, kid. Trust it, but don't let it carry the weight alone." She glanced at Jamie, who grinned, and Eli felt the strength of their makeshift family. The night before Jamie left for college, they drove to the quarry one last time. Under the stars, Jamie pulled Eli close, his voice low. "We're going to make this work," he said. "You and me, we're bigger than distance." Eli kissed him, pouring all his love and fear into it. "I know," he whispered, and he meant it. They fell asleep on the blanket, the stars their only witnesses. The next morning, Jamie's car was packed, his parents waiting to drive him to the airport. Eli stood in the driveway, his heart heavy but full. "Call me when you land," he said, his voice thick. "Every day?" Jamie promised, pulling him into a fierce hug. As the car pulled away, Eli felt a hand on his shoulder. David, who'd shown up unannounced. "You okay?" David asked, his voice gentle. Eli nodded, wiping his eyes. "Yeah. Just gonna miss him." David hesitated, then said, "I know what it's like to lose someone you love. Don't let go of him, Eli." The words carried weight, a promise and a warning. The first weeks of college were a whirlwind. Eli threw himself into his classes, his writing a lifeline. He and Jamie texted constantly, their late-night calls filled with laughter and longing. David kept his word, calling weekly, sending care packages with books and snacks. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. But Willow Creek's shadow lingered. A letter arrived from an old classmate, filled with hate, accusing Eli of ruining the town's image. He showed it to David during a visit, his hands shaking. David read it, his jaw tight, then tore it in half. "This doesn't define you," he said. "You're more than their small minds." Eli felt a shift, a trust he hadn't dared hope for. David wasn't just staying, was fighting for him. That night, Eli wrote a story about a boy who found his father again. Not perfect, but present. It was raw, messy, true. As winter approached, Eli planned a trip to visit Jamie, his heart racing at the thought of seeing him. David offered to drive him to the airport, a small gesture that felt monumental. In the car, Eli looked at his father, seeing not just the man who'd left, but the one who'd come back. The airport was a blur of noise and motion, but Eli's focus was singular: Jamie, waiting at the gate, his smile brighter than the fluorescent lights. They collided in a hug, the months apart melting away in the warmth of Jamie's arms. "Missed you," Jamie whispered, and Eli felt whole again. David stood back, watching with a quiet smile. "Take care of him," he told Jamie, his voice gruff but warm. Jamie nodded, and for a moment, Eli saw a bridge between his past and his future, fragile, but real. The visit was a whirlwind of beach walks, late-night talks, and stolen kisses in Jamie's dorm. They planned their future summers together, maybe a shared apartment after college. Eli felt the weight of his old fears lift, replaced by a certainty that their love could weather anything. Back in Willow Creek, Eli and David grew closer, their bond a slow but steady rebuild. David attended Eli's first college reading, clapping louder than anyone when Eli shared a poem about love and loss. Sarah was there too, her eyes shining with pride. Afterward, they ate at the diner, the three of them laughing like a family, imperfect but whole. The harassment didn't stop. Entirely small towns hold grudges, but Eli faced it with new strength. He wrote about it, his words a shield and a sword. Jamie's letters, filled with sketches and love, kept him grounded. David's steady presence, once a ghost, became a cornerstone. On graduation day, 2 years later, Eli stood on the stage, his cap slightly askew, and scanned the crowd. Jamie was in the front row, cheering wildly. Sarah was beside him, tears in her eyes. And there, in the back, was David, his face lit with pride. Eli's heart swelled, not just for the degree in his hand, but for the family he'd built, piece by painful piece. That night, at the quarry, Eli and Jamie sat under the stars, their hands clasped. "We made it," Jamie said, his voice thick with emotion. "Yeah," Eli said, looking at the boy who'd changed his life, the father who'd returned, the mother who'd never left. "We did." The journey hadn't been easy: abandonment, prejudice, fear, but it had led here, to a love that endured, a family redefined. Eli knew the road ahead would have its challenges, but with Jamie's hand in his and David's quiet support, he was ready. The past had shaped him, but it no longer owned him. He was free to write his own story, one of love, resilience, and a father who came back.